There's a moment in a documentary released in the summer of 2025 where Mariska Hargitay, one of the most celebrated actresses of her generation, sits alone watching footage of a woman she cannot remember. The woman on the screen is laughing, enormous and incandescent, filling the frame the way she always filled every frame she ever entered. She is wearing something pink. She is performing for a camera with the practiced ease of someone who has been performing since before she could read. She is 31 years old. She has 2 years left to live. And the woman watching her, the daughter she left behind in the back seat of a car on a Louisiana highway at 2:25 in the morning, is trying to find her mother inside the image and finding how much work that requires. That image, more than the daughter searching for the woman inside the spectacle, is the truest possible introduction to the story of Jayne Mansfield. She was, for a brief and blazing period in the middle of the 20th century, one of the most recognized people on earth. She built that recognition deliberately, methodically, using every tool available to an exceptionally beautiful and exceptionally intelligent woman in 1950s America. She succeeded beyond any reasonable expectation. She got the mansion and the magazine covers and the studio contract and the fan mail arriving by the truckload and the comparisons to Marilyn Monroe that were meant to diminish her and that she refused to be diminished by. She got everything she had driven herself towards since she was a girl in Pennsylvania with a dead father and a violin under her arm and a certainty, unearned but unshakable, that the world was larger than the one she had been handed at birth. And then, at 33 years old, on a road outside New Orleans, it ended. Not with the dignity of a long life reflected upon, not with the satisfaction of work completed, not with the quiet of someone who had finished what they came to finish, but with the terrible arbitrariness of a car hitting a slowed truck in the dark at 2:25 in the morning on a highway that thousands of people drove every day without incident. She deserved better than the image she created. She deserved better than the story that most people carry when they hear her name. She deserved the full accounting, the one that begins not with the blonde hair or the measurements or the pink mansion, but with the girl who was 3 years old when her father died and who spent the rest of her life building something large enough to fill that first enormous absence. This is that accounting. This is the story of who Vera Jayne Palmer actually was, what she built, what it cost her, and what her life, all 33 years of it, ultimately meant. Before we go any further, a quick word to everyone watching right now. Wherever you are in the world, drop your location in the comments below because this community spans every continent, and it genuinely matters to know who is here. If you are new to this channel and stories like this one are what you came looking for, please subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss another one. Now, and the story of Jayne Mansfield begins not in Hollywood and not in a pink mansion in Holmby Hills, but in a very different kind of place, in a suburb of Philadelphia in the first years of the Great Depression, in the kind of house where lawyers lived and children grew up with reasonable expectations about the shape their lives would take. Bryn Mawr, Pennsylvania, in 1933, was exactly what it sounds like. Careful, prosperous, measured. The kind of suburb where the lawns were kept and the expectations were clear and the path from childhood to adulthood ran through predictable stages that most people completed without serious deviation. It was not, by any external measure, the kind of place that produces the most famous blonde in America. But then the most famous blonde in America was not produced by the place. She was produced by what happened to her there, and what happened to her there was the first and most defining loss of her life. Vera Jayne Palmer was born on April 19, 1933, the only child of Herbert William Palmer, an attorney, and Vera Jeffrey Palmer, a woman whose ambitions for her daughter would eventually reshape themselves around whatever her daughter decided she was going to become. The family was comfortable by the standards of an era when comfort was not guaranteed. Herbert Palmer was professionally established. The house was solid. The future was, from the outside, arranged. And then Herbert Palmer died of a heart attack. Vera Jayne was 3 years old. 3 years old is young enough that the loss does not arrive as grief, not in the way that grief arrives when you are old enough to understand what has been taken. At 3, the father who was there is simply gone, and the world reorganizes itself around his absence, without providing a map for what that reorganization means. You do not mourn what you never fully had. But the shape of what is missing becomes part of the shape of everything that follows. It writes itself into the architecture of who you become. It asks questions that take decades to articulate and longer still to answer. Her mother eventually remarried a man named Harry Piers, a sales executive, and the family moved. First to Dallas, Texas, where Jayne spent a significant portion of her childhood and adolescence, and later to Phillipsburg, New Jersey, where she attended high school. She was, by every account from those years, sexy, a child of unusual qualities. She studied violin from an early age and reached a level of genuine proficiency that was not merely decorative, not the kind of music lessons that children of comfortable families receive to round out their education, but actual skill, the kind that required practice and commitment and a natural aptitude that was real. She later claimed some fluency in French and Italian, and while the precise degree of that fluency was sometimes gently questioned by people who knew her, the underlying engagement with language was not invented. She was learning, she was absorbing, she was reaching for things. She was also, from adolescence, strikingly beautiful in a way that generated its own kind of attention, the kind that a girl in mid-century America learned to navigate whether she wanted to or not. Tall, blonde, someone with a physical presence that was impossible to overlook and a face that cameras would eventually discover was something close to ideal. She was aware of this the way that young women of her era were taught to be aware of it, which is to say that she understood her beauty as the primary currency the world had decided to assign her, and she had no intention of leaving it unspent. But she also understood even then, with a clarity that would become the most important thing about her, that currency depreciates and that what she needed to build was something more durable than a face. The IQ she claimed throughout her career, 163, was reported so widely and so consistently that it entered the cultural record alongside her measurements and her hair color as a defining biographical fact. Whether the precise number was accurate or slightly embellished, the underlying reality was never seriously disputed by the people who actually worked with her and had reason to form a genuine opinion. She was sharper than the roles she was given required her to be. She was considerably more intelligent than the image she created suggested. She knew both of these things with perfect clarity, and she made a calculation, correct in the short term and complicated in the long term, that advertising the intelligence too loudly was not the most effective strategy for a woman who looked the way she looked in the America of the early 1950s. In January of 1950, she married Paul Mansfield. She was 16 years old. She was pregnant. The marriage was, by most readings, a practical arrangement made quickly to manage a situation that the social codes of her era demanded be managed in precisely this way. Though Paul Mansfield was, by the accounts available to us, not an unkind man, and the relationship was not without genuine feeling on both sides. Their daughter, Jayne Marie Mansfield, was born later that year. Jayne kept his surname for the rest of her life, not out of lingering sentiment for a marriage that would not survive the decade, but because she had already, even at 16, begun to understand that names were part of the construction, and that Jayne Mansfield was a more promising name for the person she intended to become than Vera Jayne Palmer had ever been. What happened next is the part of the story that tends to disappear entirely inside the later image. Swallowed by the blonde hair and the Pink Palace and the studio publicity machine that would eventually package and sell her to the world. She enrolled at Southern Methodist University in Dallas and later at the University of Texas at Austin, studying drama, while simultaneously raising an infant daughter and being married to a man who had not necessarily imagined this exact version of their shared future. She was not surrendering to domesticity. She was actively, deliberately refusing to. In the mid-1950s, for a young married woman with a baby and no money and no professional connections, and no reason that the world could identify for believing she would amount to anything in particular, continuing her education and pursuing an acting career simultaneously was not the obvious choice. It was the willful choice, the stubborn choice, the choice of someone who had decided before the world had given her any particular reason for confidence that she was going somewhere specific, and that the obstacles between here and there were logistical in nature rather than fundamental. She entered beauty pageants in Texas and won some of them. She attracted local attention. She performed in regional theater productions wherever opportunities presented themselves. She built, piece by piece, with the patience and the methodical persistence that the later spectacle of her public persona made difficult to perceive, the foundation for what would eventually come. And what would eventually come required Los Angeles. It always required Los Angeles for people of her particular ambition in the mid-20th century. In 1954, she persuaded Paul Mansfield to move with her to California so she could pursue what she had been moving toward since before she had words for it. He agreed. The marriage would not survive the move by very many years, but the career that began on the other side of it would change everything, beginning with her own understanding of what she was capable of. Hollywood in 1954 was not what Jayne Mansfield had imagined it would be, but then it is never what anyone imagines it will be, least of all the people who arrive there burning with a particular fire that she was burning with. What she found was not a city that recognized her potential and moved immediately to develop it. What she found was a city that had no particular reason to notice her at all. Bijdorf, a city populated with hundreds of young women who were beautiful and ambitious and willing to work, and that did not immediately distinguish between those who were exceptional and those who merely believed themselves to be. The distinction was something she would have to demonstrate, and the demonstration would take longer than she had patience for, and she would find a way to make it happen anyway. The early months were difficult in the standard ways and some non-standard ones as well. She auditioned at the major studios and was not signed. She went to Paramount and left without a contract. She went to Warner Brothers and left without a contract. She took work where she could find it. She modeled. She appeared in small television productions that led nowhere in particular. She worked for a period selling candy at a movie theater, which was not what she had moved to Los Angeles to do, but which was what was available. And so, she did it. She was one of hundreds of young women in that city at that moment who were trying to convert beauty and ambition into a career, and the conversion rate was not high and had never been high, and was not going to improve for her, specifically, until she found a different angle of approach. She understood something that most of her competitors did not fully grasp, or grasped, but were unwilling to act on. Fame in the mid-1950s was not a single, unified thing with a single pathway into it. It was an ecosystem with multiple entry points, and not all of those entry points required a studio contract, or a film credit, or the approval of someone at the top of a hierarchy who had decided you were ready. Hugh Hefner had launched Playboy magazine in December of 1953, and in its first 2 years the magazine was establishing itself as something genuinely new in the American cultural landscape. It positioned itself as sophisticated and modern and distinctly adult, and it reached a significant and aspirational male audience that the major studios also wanted to reach. Appearing in Playboy in those early years was not the same thing as appearing in a film. It did not convey the same kind of institutional legitimacy, but it conveyed visibility, and visibility was the essential precondition for everything else she needed. She appeared in Playboy as the Playmate of the Month in February of 1955, the second centerfold in the magazine's brief history. Hugh Hefner later described her as one of the most significant playmates of the magazine's founding period, not merely because of her physical presence, which was undeniable and considerable, but because of the quality she brought to the camera. She was not passive in front of a lens. She had never been passive in front of anything. She was active and deliberate and entirely aware of exactly what she was constructing and why. There is a distinction between being photographed and knowing how to be photographed, between being looked at and directing the looking, and Mansfield had understood that distinction before most photographers had the opportunity to explain it to her. The Playboy appearance worked precisely as she had intended it to. It generated attention, and that attention translated into opportunities. And the first major opportunity that materialized was one that would demonstrate something the photographs alone could not, that she was funny, genuinely, unexpectedly, architecturally funny, in a way that no one who had simply looked at her pictures could have anticipated. In 1955, she made her Broadway debut in a play called Will Success Spoil Rock Hunter, a satirical comedy that took pointed and intelligent aim at the mythology of Hollywood stardom and the specific variety of blonde bombshell celebrity that was being constructed around Marilyn Monroe at exactly the moment Mansfield was trying to find her own way into that conversation. The role she played was Rita Marlowe, a character who was part Monroe parody and part self-portrait. Ra's a famous and impossibly beautiful actress who was considerably more intelligent than anyone around her, was prepared to believe, who understood the game being played with her image, and who was playing it back. The comedy worked because Mansfield made it work. She had timing that was not learned in classes, but that was the product of some innate understanding of rhythm and expectation, and the precise moment at which the comic turn arrives. She understood that the joke was funnier when the person telling it appeared to understand exactly what was funny about it, and that understanding was the most visible thing about her performance, more visible even than the physical presence that drew every eye in every room she entered. The play was a success. Critics noticed her. Mansfield won the Theatre World Award for her performance, which was an acknowledgement from the serious theatrical community that what she was doing on that stage was not simply the display of a physical asset, but the exercise of a genuine talent. 20th Century Fox, which had a professional and financial interest in understanding what Marilyn Monroe's appeal consisted of and whether it could be reproduced or supplemented, noticed the notices. They signed Mansfield to a studio contract. And with the signing of that contract, the specific and deliberate project of becoming Jayne Mansfield entered its most consequential phase. 1956 was the year that the project completed itself, or at least appeared to complete itself, from the outside. The film was The Girl Can't Help It, directed by Frank Tashlin, Durhout Bakaiduchi, a filmmaker whose background in animation had given him an understanding of visual comedy at a level of precision that most live-action directors never reach. The film was shot in CinemaScope and color, both of which were still significant enough distinctions in 1956 to register with audiences and exhibitors, and it featured a remarkable collection of early rock and roll performers, including Little Richard, Fats Domino, Eddie Cochran, and Gene Vincent, artists who were at that precise moment defining what American popular music was going to become. The film was, structurally, a comedy about a gangster who wants to turn his girlfriend into a singing star, regardless of whether she has any talent. It was also, by design and accident both, a document of a specific cultural moment in American music and American ideas about femininity and ambition that has only grown more interesting as the decades that followed it have accumulated. Mansfield was the center of the film, and she held it. She played Jerry Jordan with a combination of physical presentation so deliberate it became its own kind of joke and comic timing so precise it made the joke land in a different register than the audience had prepared itself for. She walked through scenes in ways that commanded every eye in the frame and then delivered a line reading that demonstrated the walking had been set up rather than subject. She was not decoration in service of the comedy. She was the mechanism by which the comedy operated. Tashlin, who understood exactly what he had, pointed the camera at her and let her do the thing she did, which was to make an audience believe simultaneously that she was exactly what she appeared to be, and that she was something considerably more complicated than that appearance suggested. The commercial response was immediate and enthusiastic. The critical response was warm, with reviewers noting, in the particular tone of pleasantly condescending surprise that women of her type received from critics of that era, that she was actually funny, not visually amusing, not decoratively comic, actually funny, with actual timing in ways that distinguished her from the category she was being placed in, even as the placement was being made. Tashlin directed her again the following year in the film version of Will Success Spoil Rock Hunter. Hainem weighing so incitsiden pioneers, Mott, which gave her comic gifts and even more explicitly satirical context to work within, and produced a performance that remains one of the most accomplished and underappreciated pieces of screen comedy of its decade. In 1957, she won the Golden Globe Award for New Star of the Year. She was on the cover of magazines across Europe and America. The fan mail arrived in volumes that required dedicated staff to manage. She was recognized everywhere she went in every country where her films played, which by 1957 was most of them. The world was paying complete and undivided attention, which was what she had been working toward since she was a teenager in Texas. And at the height of all of it, she built the Pink Palace. The house in Holmby Hills was 40 rooms. It was painted in shades of pink, from the exterior walls to the interior furnishings. a total commitment to a color that was simultaneously her brand and her joke, and her genuine aesthetic preference, and her declaration that she was not going to pretend to be something more restrained than what she actually was. There was a heart-shaped swimming pool. There was reportedly pink champagne available on tap in the kitchen. There were pink carpets and pink furniture and pink fixtures throughout, a level of deliberate extravagance that journalists who were given access described in terms that veered between admiration and disbelief, which was precisely the combination the Pink Palace was designed to produce. It was a home. It was a marketing tool. It was a monument to the distance she had traveled from Bryn Mawr, Pennsylvania. And it was, though this dimension of it would only become fully visible in retrospect, a kind of trap. A declaration of identity so total and so public that revising it would have required dismantling the very structure that had made her famous, and she did not have the luxury of that kind of revision. The image was the product was the career, and the career was, at that particular moment, everything. She was 23 years old when she moved into the Pink Palace. She had been manufacturing herself deliberately and methodically for most of her conscious life. She had a daughter from a marriage that was ending, a studio contract, a Golden Globe, an image so vivid and so specific that it was already beginning to harden around her, the way amber hardens around the thing it preserves. She had always been, after all, the woman who understood the performance from the inside, who could see its architecture while executing it, and who had never once confused the character she was playing with the person she actually was. That awareness was her greatest private resource, and it was also increasingly the loneliest thing about her. The man who became her husband in January of 1958 was named Miklós Hargitay, known to everyone as Mickey, and the first useful fact to establish about him is that he had won the Mr. Universe title in 1955, because that fact tends to produce an impression that is accurate as far as it goes, but that misses the more important truth. Mickey Hargitay was physically extraordinary, yes. In Croy, a Hungarian immigrant who had rebuilt himself in America with the particular intensity that immigrants of his generation brought to the project of reinvention. But he was also, in every account from people who knew him in the context of his relationship with Jayne Mansfield, a genuinely gentle person, patient where she was impatient, stable where she was always in motion, devoted in a way that absorbed considerable difficulty without appearing to diminish or to complain. They had met in 1956 and moved through courtship in the particular accelerated way that people move through courtship when both of them are famous and the press is watching. The wedding in January of 1958 generated significant coverage. The images from it were exactly what the images from a Jayne Mansfield event were always exactly. They were also, underneath the spectacle, a genuine couple, two people who had found in each other something that each of them needed at that particular moment, and who would spend several years trying to make it last. They had 3 children together. Miklós Jr. was born in 1958. Zoltán arrived in 1960, and on January 13, 1964, a daughter was born whom they named Mariska. That daughter would become, in the decades following her mother's death, one of the most consistently celebrated actresses in American television, winning the Golden Globe for Best Actress in a Drama Series in 2005, and the Emmy for Outstanding Lead Actress in a Drama Series in 2006 for her work as Detective Olivia Benson in Law and Order, Special Victims Unit. She would also become, in 2025, the person who finally told her mother's full story in the HBO documentary she directed herself. In that documentary, Mariska disclosed something she had carried privately for decades. She had learned at the age of 25 that her biological father was not Mickey Hargitay, but an Italian entertainer named Nelson Sardelli, with whom her mother had been involved during a period of separation from Hargitay, before the divorce was finalized. Hargitay had raised Mariska as his own daughter without ever telling her otherwise. The revelation added a layer of complexity to the picture of the marriage and of the period surrounding Mariska's birth that the documentary explored with the careful honesty of a daughter who loves the man who raised her and is simultaneously trying to understand the woman she never had the chance to know. Through the years of the Hargitay marriage, Mansfield brought her children to film sets and on tour during her nightclub performances. She did not separate the domestic from the professional because she could not. and perhaps also because she did not want to. She was a mother who refused to stop working, which placed her in consistent and visible tension with the cultural expectations of an era that had very clear ideas about what wives and mothers were supposed to prioritize. She did not prioritize those things. She prioritized everything simultaneously, which was its own kind of statement and its own kind of cost. The press loved her and Hargitay together. They were photographed constantly, their combined physical presence producing exactly the kind of image that mid-century celebrity journalism found irresistible. In 1957, she attended a Hollywood dinner at which the other notable attendee was the Italian actress Sophia Loren. A photographer captured the moment when Loren, seated across the table, directed toward Mansfield's spectacularly low-cut dress, a look that has been analyzed, contextualized, argued over, and reproduced more times than either woman would have wished. The photograph is famous because it is honest. It captured something real about the way Mansfield occupied every room she entered. She always pushed slightly past the line that rooms drew around acceptable behavior. She was always daring the assembled witnesses to look, and they always looked, and that was always the point. She played violin at parties and in private. She spoke about literature and music and history in conversations that surprised people who had come expecting the performance and found instead something closer to the person underneath it. The performance was real, but so was the person. They coexisted in a way that most of the coverage of her life, then and later, never quite managed to hold in its frame simultaneously. The studio system that built Jayne Mansfield was, by the final years of the 1950s, beginning the process of letting her go. As though the process was gradual enough and sufficiently obscured by the ongoing machinery of her public life that it was not immediately legible even to her. 20th Century Fox in the late 1950s was organized primarily around Marilyn Monroe, whose particular magic was, at that precise cultural moment, the most commercially valuable thing the studio possessed. Monroe was difficult to manage. She arrived late. She sometimes did not arrive at all. But she was also irreplaceable in a way that her intermittent availability could not change, and so Fox managed the difficulty because it had no viable alternative. Mansfield was the alternative when Monroe was unavailable. That hierarchy was unstated in formal terms and utterly explicit in practical ones, and its consequences for Mansfield's career were significant and ongoing. The scripts she received were not the scripts that built careers toward somewhere specific. They were the scripts that maintained a product, that kept an image visible without making the particular demands on that image that might have revealed what it was capable of. She understood this and said so, not quietly, not diplomatically, but with the directness that was one of her most consistent qualities. She was not grateful in the passive way the industry expected its female stars to be grateful. She was ambitious and she knew what she was worth, and she did not have patience for being managed as a secondary resource. The cultural landscape was also shifting beneath her in ways that no amount of professional intelligence could entirely address. The early 1960s were not the mid-1950s. The blonde bombshell archetype that Fox had built her around was not a permanent feature of the cultural imagination. Something rawer and more psychologically complex was beginning to assert itself, something that had less patience for the knowingly constructed femininity that had characterized the best of her work, something that valued a different kind of authenticity. The image she had spent a decade perfecting was becoming, with a speed that felt personal, even though it was entirely structural, a period piece. She made European co-productions through the early 1960s, shooting in England and Germany and Italy and Spain. The films were commercially minded and professionally modest. That's the kind of work that traded on a name above the title in exchange for a reduced version of the talent attached to that name and a fraction of the salary that the peak years had produced. She worked steadily through these years because she always worked steadily, because stopping was not something her nature permitted, and because stopping also meant confronting questions she did not yet have answers for. But the work was not the work. The roles were not the roles. And the gap between the career she had imagined and the career she was actually living was growing in ways she could feel even when she could not yet fully articulate them. Her television work expanded through this period, filling some of the space that the film work was vacating. She did nightclub work, performing in venues across the country, were standing on stages in Nevada and Mississippi and New Jersey, delivering the performance of Jayne Mansfield, the image, the spectacle, the woman who made rooms rearrange themselves around her arrival, on evenings when the distance between what she was performing and what she was living had grown wide enough to require a particular kind of courage to bridge. She was professional in all of it. She showed up. She delivered what was expected. The gap was real, and it was widening, and she was aware of it every day. The Hargitay marriage formally ended in 1963. The divorce was followed by a brief reconciliation that produced Mariska in January of 1964, and then the finalization of the divorce. And then Hargitay moved forward into a quiet and stable life that was the opposite in almost every way of the life she was still living. And the contrast between those two trajectories said something about both of them that needed no elaboration. In 1964, she married Matt Cimber, a director with whom she had previously worked on a Broadway production. The marriage was troubled from stages early enough to suggest it had been troubled before it officially began, and it was dissolved in 1966 after the birth of their son Antonio Cimber in 1965. 3 marriages, 3 endings, each one arriving faster than the one before it, each one leaving a different kind of residue. Looking at the arc of her relationships from a distance sufficient to see the full shape of it, a pattern becomes visible that was probably less legible from inside any individual chapter of it. Each marriage had promised something she needed and had not delivered it in a form that lasted. Paul Mansfield had been a practical arrangement that dissolved quietly when its practical purposes had been served and when the ambitions it had been constraining could no longer be contained by it. Hargitay had been a genuine partnership between 2 people who complemented each other in important ways and who were ultimately not able to hold the partnership together against the pressures of the life she was insisting on living. Cimber had been a professional connection turned personal that had not survived the transition. She was not passive in any of these relationships. She was searching through each of them, even for something that her public life could not provide, for a kind of recognition that the fan mail and the magazine covers and the packed nightclub audiences could gesture toward but could not actually deliver. She wanted to be loved without being managed. She wanted to be understood without having to perform the understanding for someone else's benefit. She wanted someone who could hold steady while she was in motion without requiring that the motion slow down to accommodate their equilibrium. These are not unusual things to want. They are simply very difficult to find, and more difficult still when the person looking for them is living at the velocity and the visibility at which she was living. The attorney she hired to help her escape the Cimber marriage was named Sam Brody. And within months of the hiring, he had become the most damaging presence of her adult life. Brody was not gentle in the way that Hargitay had been gentle. He was not patient or stable. He was possessive and controlling and volatile, with a pattern of behavior that the people around Mansfield observed and worried about in ways they were not always able to act on. Her daughter Jayne Marie, speaking in the 2025 HBO documentary My Mom Jayne, described the household during the Brody period as frightening. Her son Zoltán Hargitay spoke in the same documentary and corroborated his sister's account in specific terms. Mickey Hargitay's wife Ellen provided testimony that aligned with both of theirs. Brody's own wife Beverly, in filing for divorce, identified Mansfield as one of many women, the 41st specifically named, in a pattern of infidelity that predated and continued during his involvement with Mansfield. The picture that emerges from these accounts is of a woman who was, in the final period of her life, in a situation that was damaging her and her children in concrete and serious ways, and who may have been too exhausted or too financially pressured or too deeply enmeshed in the circumstances of the relationship to see a clear path out of it. She kept working through all of it: club dates, television appearances, personal appearances that required her to stand in front of audiences and be Jayne Mansfield fully and without visible reservation, on evenings when the distance between what she was performing and what she was living had never been greater. In November of 1966, and while visiting the roadside animal attraction Jungle Land USA in Thousand Oaks, California, her son Zoltán was attacked by a lion that bit him on the neck. The injury was severe and immediately life-threatening. He was transported to Community Memorial Hospital in Ventura, California, where he underwent 3 surgeries one of which lasted 6 hours. He developed meningitis during his recovery. He survived, but the ordeal was long and terrifying, and took place under the full glare of press coverage that treated it with the mix of prurient interest and performative concern that characterized the press's relationship to everything in Jayne Mansfield's life. Brody filed suit against Jungleland USA on the family's behalf, seeking $1,600,000 in damages, and through all of it, the bookings continued. She was scheduled in Biloxi. She was scheduled in New Orleans. She was going to all of them because she did not know how to do anything else, and because the alternative to going was a stillness she had never once in her adult life been able to tolerate. June 28, 1967. She was performing at a supper club in Biloxi, Mississippi, on a warm Gulf Coast evening of the kind that makes the air feel like something physical, something that pushes back when you move through it. The engagement was the kind of work she had been doing for several years. Nightclub appearances in secondary markets, performances built around the name and the image and the memory of the films that audiences had loved a decade earlier. She was 33 years old. She had been in the entertainment industry for 13 years. She had been famous for 11 of them. The performance that night at the Biloxi Club proceeded as expected. She was, by the accounts of people who were present, professional and present, and entirely the thing the audience had come to see. After the show, in the hours following midnight, she and Sam Brody and their driver, a man named Ronald B. Harrison, got into a car and began the drive toward New Orleans, Louisiana, where she was scheduled to appear as a guest on a local morning television program. 3 of her children were in the back seat. Miklós Zoltán and 3-year-old Mariska were asleep, the way children sleep in cars on long nighttime drives, with the particular depth of unconsciousness that children manage in moving vehicles. She had 4 chihuahuas with her as well. Sorry, because the dogs were part of the life she lived, and she took the life she lived everywhere she went. On United States Route 90 at approximately 2:25 in the morning, in a stretch of road between Biloxi and New Orleans, the car was traveling at highway speed when it encountered a tractor-trailer truck that had slowed significantly because a mosquito fogging truck was operating on the road ahead of it. The distance between the car's speed and the truck's reduced speed closed in seconds. Ronald Harrison did not have time to make the adjustment. The car drove into the rear of the tractor-trailer at speed. The physics of the collision forced the car's body under the trailer's undercarriage. The trailer sheared off the roof of the car. Jayne Mansfield died instantly. Sam Brody died instantly. Ronald B. Harrison died instantly. The 3 children in the back seat were injured. Mariska, 3 years old, suffered a cut to her head. She was treated and released. She has no memory of the accident. She has no memory of her mother. Mansfield was 33 years old. In the days that followed, a rumor spread through the press and through public conversation that she had been decapitated in the collision. The rumor was false. It appears to have originated in press descriptions of the crash scene, where the sheared roof of the car created visual confusion in the darkness, and in the willingness of the entertainment press to circulate a story more dramatic than the truth. She had suffered fatal head injuries. She was not decapitated. The rumor nonetheless attached itself to the story of her death with a tenacity that said something uncomfortable about the relationship between Jayne Mansfield and the world that watched her. The body as spectacle, the image as the thing that mattered, even in death. The woman inside it subordinated, as she had so often been subordinated in life, to the story about the surface. She was 33 years old. She had been a mother of 5 children, a wife of 3 men, a studio contract star, a Broadway performer, a Golden Globe winner, a nightclub headliner, a cultural phenomenon, and a person whose intelligence and humor and genuine warmth were consistently overlooked in favor of the image she had built, because the image was more convenient and more profitable and more easily reproduced than the person had ever been. The 3 children in the back seat were collected by Mickey Hargitay, who had always been the most reliable person in their lives, and who now became the person responsible for raising them through the aftermath of something that no amount of reliability fully prepares you for. He did it. He did it steadily and without complaint, and with the kind of love that does not require documentation, because the people it was directed toward felt it clearly enough to carry it for the rest of their lives. The obituaries that appeared in the days following the crash were, in their way, entirely honest about the surface of Jayne Mansfield's life, and largely incurious about anything underneath it. They named the films, they noted the measurements, they mentioned the Pink Palace and the marriages and the platinum hair. They used the vocabulary of the categories she had been placed in: bombshell, sexpot, blonde, voluptuous. The terms that had followed her since 1956, and that followed her now into the accounting of her death. Some of the obituaries were warm and expressed something close to genuine grief for a career that had never fully delivered what the early films had promised. Some reproduced the decapitation rumor with a brief disclaimer of its falseness that did not prevent them from including it, because the rumor was more interesting than the truth. She would have recognized the pattern. She had been watching it operate on her life for 11 years. Her estate was assessed at approximately $600,000. This figure included the Pink Palace, valued at $100,000, a sports car that sold for $7,000, her jewelry, and the estate of Sam Brody, who had named her as his beneficiary in his final will. It was a modest sum against the scale of what the peak years had produced and suggested. She had earned significant money during the period from 1956 to 1960. She had also spent significant money during the period from 1956 to 1960. She had also spent significant money during the period from 1956 to 1960. She had also spent significant money during the period from 1956 to 1960. She had also spent significant money during the period from 1956 to 1960. She had also spent significant money during the period from 1956 to 1960. She had also spent significant money during the period from 1956 to 1960. She had also spent significant money during the period from 1956 to 1960. She had also spent significant money during the period from 1956 to 1960. She had also spent significant money during the period from 1956 to 1960. She had also spent significant money during the period from 1956 to 1960. She had also spent significant money during the period from 1956 to 1960. She had also spent significant money during the period from 1956 to 1960. She had also spent significant money during the period from 1956 to 1960. She had also spent significant money during the period from 1956 to 1960. She had also spent significant money during the period from 1956 to 1960. She had also spent significant money during the period from 1956 to 1960. She had also spent significant money during the period from 1956 to 1960. She had also spent significant money during the period from 1956 to 1960. She had also spent significant money during the period from 1956 to 1960. She had also spent significant money during the period from 1956 to 1960. She had also spent significant money during the period from 1956 to 1960. She had also spent significant money during the period from 1956 to 1960. She had also spent significant money during the period from 1956 to 1960. She had also spent significant money during the period from 1956 to 1960. She had also spent significant money during the period from 1956 to 1960. She had also spent significant money during the period from 1956 to 1960. She had also spent significant money during the period from 1956 to 1960. She had also spent significant money during the period from 1956 to 1960. She had also spent significant money during the period from 1956 to 1960. She had also spent significant money during the period from 1956 to 1960. She had also spent significant money during the period from 1956 to 1960. She had also spent significant money during the 60. She had also spent significant money on the Pink Palace and its maintenance, on the costs of 3 marriages and their dissolutions, on the nightclub circuit that kept her working and visible without keeping her wealthy. The gap between what she had earned and what she had accumulated was one more version of the gap between the image and the reality that had defined her entire adult life. The Pink Palace was sold. It changed hands over the following decades and was eventually demolished, replaced by something more conventionally useful. The heart-shaped pool was filled. The 40 rooms became something else entirely. The monument to her own success that she had built at 23 was gone, leaving nothing behind but photographs that people look at still, with the particular mixture of recognition and distance that photographs of the dead always produce, her children dispersed into the care of their fathers. Mickey Hargitay took Miklós and Zoltán and Mariska and raised them with a steadiness and a devotion that each of them has spoken about in terms that make clear it was real and sustained and enough. Jayne Marie, the oldest daughter from the first marriage, navigated her own path through the aftermath of a mother who had been everywhere and then suddenly nowhere. So the world moved on in the way the world always moves on, which is to say without ceremony and without much acknowledgement of what it is moving away from. More than 5 decades passed between the night on United States Route 90 and the June evening in 2025 when a documentary called My Mom Jayne appeared on HBO. In the intervening years, Mariska Hargitay had become one of the most respected and beloved actresses in American television, accumulating over 2 decades of critically recognized work on Law and Order, Special Victims Unit, winning her Golden Globe in 2005 and her Emmy in 2006, and building alongside her acting career a foundation dedicated to addressing sexual violence against women and children that has become one of the most significant advocacy organizations in the country. She had built from the materials of a childhood shaped by loss and absence a life of extraordinary purpose and achievement and connection. She rarely spoke publicly about her mother during those decades. When she did, the care in her words was evident. She was speaking about a stranger who was also the most intimate possible presence, a woman she knew primarily from footage and photographs and the accounts of people who had survived her and who had their own complicated relationships to what they remembered. She was reaching towards something that the available record had never fully allowed her to reach. The documentary was her decision to reach directly. She directed it herself. She interviewed her siblings. She interviewed people who had known her mother as a colleague and a friend, and a difficult and luminous presence in their professional lives. She sat with footage she had seen before and footage she was seeing for the first time. She was, by the accounts of people who saw the finished film, raw in it in ways that the controlled and professional public persona she had built over decades did not usually permit. The rawness was the point. The rawness was the gift. In the documentary, she disclosed publicly for the first time something she had known since the age of 25. Her biological father was not Mickey Hargitay, but Nelson Sardelli, an Italian entertainer with whom her mother had been involved during a period of separation from Hargitay in the years before the divorce was finalized. She had sat with this knowledge privately for decades, processing it in whatever ways a person processes the discovery that the foundational facts of their own origins are different than they believed. And then she decided to say it publicly because the full story was the only story worth telling, and the full story required that detail to be complete. The documentary was received as a significant work of biographical filmmaking and as a substantial act of reclamation. It argued, through its structure and its evidence and its emotional honesty, that Jayne Mansfield had been more than the image, that the image was real but incomplete, so that the woman who played violin and studied drama and enrolled in university while raising an infant daughter and moved to Los Angeles with nothing but determination and built from that determination one of the most recognizable careers of the mid-20th century, that this woman was worth knowing on her own terms, not merely as a blonde bombshell, not merely as a Monroe rival, not merely as the woman who died on that Louisiana road, but as a full human being whose life had contained multitudes that the coverage of it had consistently declined to honor. There is something on the rear of every large commercial truck on American highways, a horizontal bar of metal mounted low across the back of the trailer, designed to prevent a smaller vehicle from sliding underneath the truck's body in a collision. It is required by federal regulation. It is inspected as part of routine commercial vehicle safety checks. Most of the people who drive behind large trucks every day of their lives have no idea what the bar is called, or where the name attached to it came from. It is called the Mansfield Bar. The regulation requiring underride guards on large commercial vehicles was proposed by the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration in the period following the June 1967 crash that demonstrated with catastrophic clarity what happened when a passenger vehicle traveling at highway speed struck the rear of a truck that had nothing to prevent it from sliding underneath. The standards were finalized and implemented over years and across multiple regulatory cycles. When the name that attached itself to the safety device was never made official by any federal document. But the trucking industry and the safety community, and eventually the wider public, came to call it the Mansfield Bar, because her death was the event that made the necessity of it impossible to continue ignoring. Every year, on roads across the United States and in countries that have adopted similar regulations, the Mansfield Bar prevents accidents that would otherwise be fatal. It is a monument that almost no one recognizes as a monument. It is more widely distributed and more practically useful than the Pink Palace ever was. It is also, in some ways that bear thinking about, the most honest memorial she could have. She spent her life in motion. She spent her life working. She died on a road in a car on her way to a television appearance. While he's still moving, still performing, still doing the thing she had never been able to stop doing. And what she left behind was not a museum or a preserved home or a foundation with her name on the letterhead. What she left behind was a piece of metal on the back of a truck that keeps people alive on dark roads. That is not a small thing. The films remain as well for anyone who goes looking, and the people who go looking tend to find something they were not prepared for. The Girl Can't Help It presents a performer who does not match the mythology that accumulated around her name. The woman on screen is genuinely funny. Her timing is architectural and precise. Her understanding of the material is evident in every scene. She was not a beautiful woman doing comedy. She was a comic actress who happened to be beautiful. And the difference between those two things is visible in the film from the first frame to the last. Will success spoil Rock Hunter? Makes the same case with even greater force because the satire is more explicit and the execution is sharper. And because throughout it, you can see a performer who is capable of considerably more than she was ever fully given the opportunity to demonstrate. The ongoing reassessment of her place in the history of celebrity and gender in American popular culture has accelerated significantly in the 21st century. She has been examined as a pioneer in the deliberate construction of celebrity identity, as an early and sophisticated example of the tension between a public persona and the private person. It both expresses and conceals. As a woman who operated with exceptional strategic intelligence in a system that had no interest in her intelligence and every interest in her image. The comparison to Monroe that was used in her lifetime to position her as a lesser version of something greater has been reconsidered by critics who find the comparison more complicated in both directions than its original framing ever allowed for. She was 33 years old. She had made films on 2 continents. She had performed on Broadway and appeared in one of the most widely circulated magazines in the world, and married 3 times and raised 5 children in the margins of a career that never stopped demanding everything she had. She had built a 40-room pink mansion and lived in it fully and lost it along with most of the other things she had built. So she had been loved and used and watched and photographed and misunderstood, and occasionally, in the moments that mattered most, seen clearly. And she had done all of it with a violin somewhere in the background and an intelligence that the world had consistently declined to take seriously, and a dead father at the center of her earliest understanding of what the world was. Mariska Hargitay, in the documentary, is shown watching footage of her mother laughing. The laughter is large and unguarded and entirely genuine. The laughter of someone who finds something funny, at the level where finding something funny is not a performance, but a response. Mariska is watching it with the expression of someone who is trying to feel something that the absence of shared experience makes difficult to fully access. She is reaching toward a person who is entirely present on the screen and entirely gone from the world, and she is doing it anyway, because the only alternative is to leave the reaching undone, and she has decided that leaving it undone is not something she is willing to do. Jayne Mansfield deserved to be reached toward. She deserved the documentary. She deserved the reassessment. She deserved a daughter willing to sit down decades after the fact and say, clearly and publicly, that the image was not the whole story, and that the whole story mattered, and that the woman who created the image had been real and intelligent and funny and devoted and complicated in the ways that real people are complicated and worth knowing as a person rather than as a phenomenon. She was brilliant at the construction of herself. She was fearless in her ambition in ways that the culture of her era had no adequate framework for honoring in a woman. She was funny in ways that the people paid to describe her consistently undervalued because the framework for understanding her was built around what she looked like rather than what she could do. She was devoted to her children in the imperfect and genuine way of someone who loved them fiercely and was always in motion, and who found the combination of those two facts difficult to navigate, and who never stopped trying. She was aware of the trap the image had become and could see its architecture clearly, and could not find the door out of it that did not require dismantling everything she had constructed, and dismantling everything was not something she was willing to do. She was 33 years old on a Louisiana highway in the early hours of a June morning, with 3 sleeping children in the back seat and a television appearance ahead of her in New Orleans, still working, still moving, still being exactly the thing she had decided to be when she was a girl in Pennsylvania, who had lost her father before she could remember him, and who had decided, without anyone's permission and without any guarantee, that the world was going to know her name. It knows her name. It has always known her name. It is knowing it now, more fully and more honestly than it has known it before, because of a documentary, and because of the daughter who made it, and because of the slow accumulating work of time, which eventually insists on the fuller truth, even when the simpler version was more convenient for everyone involved. Now in the Mansfield bars on the back of every large truck on American highways. The films are available. The documentary exists. The daughter is alive and working, and has told the story as completely and as honestly as it can be told. If this story moved you, if it changed the way you see Jayne Mansfield, please like this video and subscribe to this channel. There are more stories waiting, stories of lives that were larger and more complicated than the images that survived them. We will be here, telling them.